Hello everybody, I'm Sam Cook and I've been asked by my good friend over at Conquer IB, Eamon Holth, to go through with you some tips, some tricks and just some little pointers and strategies in order for you to get a 7 in your IB Business Management HLIA. I graduated from high school, I think it's been 4 months ago now. I got a 7 in Business HL and particularly a 7 in my Business IA. So I thought it'd be helpful if I could go through with you some things that I think I did well in my IA, some things that I could have probably done better, and just more generally some things that I wish I knew going into the writing process for my IA in order to make the experience smoother and easier for me. So I hope you can come out of this with a finer understanding of what's necessary for your IA and how you achieve that 7. So if you're new to the IB in general or just the IB Business Management HL course, to give you a little background, I personally think this is actually one of the more enjoyable IAs you can do in the whole IB course. I mean, certainly for me, out of my 6 subjects, I think I enjoyed the research and writing process for this IA the most. The thing with this particular IA is that if you know the right structure, if you know the right points of analysis and little tips and tricks that the IB markers are looking for, I think this is actually a really painless process and you'll find yourself enjoying collecting a lot of this data and assembling it in an intuitive way. So my goal today is to demonstrate exactly how to do that and how to make the most out of this process. All right, so I have the criteria for the IA here and let's just jump straight into it. The Business Management HLIA is marked out of 25, but that particular mark is actually made up of a lot of individual criteria, as you can see here. So when I was saying earlier about you have to get the little tips and tricks and motifs that they're looking for right, that's what I mean, because the mark is split up into a lot of individual sections. So the first one in the criteria is the research proposal. So let's read what it says here. The research proposal with all the required elements is appropriate, detailed, clear and focused, and have a clearly identified, explained methodology and theoretical framework. Notice how they repeat clear and focused twice. In my opinion, that's the single most important thing with your research proposal. You want to be succinct, you want to be brief, and you only have 500 words generally to do it in. So it's really, really important that you get the information you need in the least amount of words possible. That sounds like a difficult thing, but it's actually not at all. So essentially, if you don't know what the point of the research proposal is, it's to explain essentially to the marker before you actually write your IA and do the research, what you're planning to research, what different methods you're planning to collect the data that you need, and how that's all going to look on a timeline. So this is my particular proposal on the screen here. You can see I did Mitre 10 Mount Barker, which is where my aunt works in Adelaide. So obviously one of the first things you should do in this process is think of what business you might like to do. Obviously helps if you have a family member involved, but if you don't, there are so many other ways. Go to your local like cafe or pretty much any local business. A lot of them you'd be really surprised would be willing to work with you on this. So whatever your family situation is or financial situation, there's always a way to complete this IA. That's what I've found in my experience. So first thing they're looking for in this proposal is, should Banner Mitre 10, this is what I wrote, should Banner Mitre 10 Mount Barker use non-financial rewards in order to improve employee motivation and corporate culture? So that's the research question. You're going to want to come up with that obviously before you do all the research. And that's what you lead with in your proposal, as you can see here. So just to give some general tips about the research question itself, the most effective style for a research question, in my opinion, is should company, so Banner Mitre 10, do X in order for Y to happen or in order to change Y. So what I did following that formula was, should Banner Mitre 10 Mount Barker utilize non-financial awards? That's an HR thing. I personally think HR is my strong suit. In order to do Y. So in my case, it was improve employee motivation and corporate culture. If you follow that, should the business do X in order to change Y thing, I think that's the easiest way to do it. So spend some good time thinking about what exactly you want to research, what problems you think might actually exist at the business or what you think they might want to change. Even ask the business owner themselves, because often they'll give you ideas about what are some cogent points to research within the business. So that's the first part of any proposal and the first part of the whole IA writing process in general. From here, the proposal is pretty straightforward. And the one thing I'd recommend, again, keep it succinct and even keep it dot pointed at times. So first thing you're going to want is a business rationale. So that basically explains why you're choosing this business and why you think your question is applicable and good for the business. So you want to say essentially what I wrote, which is why it's in the business's best interest to have this question researched. That doesn't have to be too long, even though that'll probably be the longest individual section of your proposal. It's only 97 words, at least mine was. So you're going to want to look for around that length. Remember, your word count is quite tight here. It's 500 words. So that's one really important part of the process, but also it can be really simple. Next, I put areas of the syllabus to be used in my research. So you don't have to, at least in my experience, find each and every individual chapter that you pulled from in your textbook or in your syllabus. I did possible sources of information in this little section here. So again, writing the future tense, as it said, you're going to want to make it seem like even if you're writing this after the fact or improving it after the fact, you're going to want to write in the future tense, because this is something that you haven't done yet in theory. Methods of collection and analysis. So this is separate. So you want collection and analysis. So collection is, your surveys, your interviews, your direct observation of the workplace, and put just a quick and direct justification of why you're picking that. So for example, for me, I picked electronic surveys for Banner Mitre 10 because, as I said, they're quick to fill out, they're intuitive, not time consuming. So again, ties back into what I said at the beginning, which is that it's in the best interest of the business for me to be conducting this. And you want to make sure the marker sees that at all points in the process. And obviously over the phone interviews. Just a quick note about what you specifically should do for methods of collection. It'll depend on your particular question, but I find these two work the best, especially with an HR topic, because HR deals with people, obviously. Electronic surveys, really good idea. Interviews, you'll probably end up doing that at some point if you can. So an interview with ideally someone in an important position at the company, just to give more insight, and you'll be putting all of that info in the appendix, which I'll show you later. And then the specific methods of analysis you'll need to include. I have 4 here, so graphs and charts. I just put various graphs and charts, which is all you can pretty much say there. Fishbone diagrams, motivation theories, culture theories. So you'll want to make it really clear what you're using, because they're going to the markers are going to look for these specific analytical techniques. And here we have, this is one of the most important parts in my mind. This is the action plan. So they want you to really rigorously timeline and schedule out what the IA process is going to look like. So in my opinion, the best way to write an action plan is to do it in a table form. So just create this table with each step in the process. So I have survey, interview writing, surveying, all the way down to interviews, and then the actual IA writing process. You put the date, the activity you'll be doing, just a short description of what that activity will look like. Again, it doesn't have to be more than, that's 6 words. So it doesn't have to be too comprehensive. Possible issues that you might face, that's an important one, which I'll get into in a bit. Adjustments and date of completion. So about the possible issues and adjustments, that ties in a lot to the reflective thinking criterion, and also obviously ties into the first criterion. Essentially, they want you to see that you've been reflecting at all points in the process. And they'll also want you to see that you've adjusted your methodology on the fly. So if you come across any issues in any step of this process, for example, when I was surveying, only 4 responses came back initially from my survey. So I wrote here that I sent out the survey again. It yielded 3 more responses. That's an adjustment that shows you've been thinking reflectively and critically. And again, that just reflects really nicely on the marker. So that's a really important part. That's one of the little details I was talking about they often pick up on, but it's also a pretty simple part in my opinion. And here's the last part of the proposal. It's pretty easy so far, right? It's a pretty intuitive writing process for the proposal. So if you get all the little details and the minutiae right, you'll get the whole thing right. But this is the last part, the Gantt chart. So this is a really good way to timeline the action plan in a more intuitive format. My Gantt chart had to be displayed sideways because it was too big. But of course, you learn about Gantt charts in the actual IB Business Management HL syllabus, so that shouldn't be too hard. There are millions of free online Gantt chart making softwares. I made this on a free online software. It was really intuitive, super easy. Then just screenshot that with the dates you have in your action plan and put it in the proposal. That's all you need to do. Super, super simple. So now we're getting onto the actual report itself, the actual IA. This is obviously where the bulk of the marks are. And this is where you have to watch out for a lot of things that they're really looking for. So I have the title page here, my question, my name. Intended audience, that's a funny little thing you do have to put in the intended audience to this report, because ideally the idea of this report is that this is going to the business that you're reporting on, that you're researching, to help them. So your intended audience will be some member of the business. I put heads of human resources at bottom out of 10 because that's what all my research is based around. But essentially, who's in charge of this particular area of the syllabus in your business, you want to put that as the intended audience. Table of contents, so that's fairly simple. I'd put, if you have appendices like I do, just put them all out in the table of contents. Again, you want to make this as intuitive as possible for the marker. Now the executive summary. The executive summary is 200 words. And the point of the executive summary is to essentially give the marker and the business the idea of what your report is without having to read the full thing. So this can actually be quite a finicky part, in my opinion, of the IA writing process, because essentially what they're asking you to do is summarize your whole IA writing process and all the research into 200 words. So what I did to combat that a little, find an easy way through it, is to separate it into 4 distinct parts. So first part is what I did, is talking about what the particular research I did is and what it was on. So I talked about the specific forms of research, the survey, the pair of interviews, and what the research was conducted into at the business. For me, it was HR processes. Make that super clear just in a short paragraph at the beginning. This isn't really a paragraph, it's 2 sentences, but that's a good part, an essential part of the executive summary. So that's your first quarter. Second quarter, I made it about what the research actually showed in terms of raw data, so without analyzing it. So my research showed that certain elements were viewed positively, other elements were viewed less positively in the whole business scheme. That's the idea. So the first half is just what you did and what you found. Then the second part is, in your executive summary, you do a quick summary of what your analysis showed. So that comes obviously later in the process. This is where you do a quick summary of your analysis that you did later in the project. I just talked about the brief things that I came up with. And I even had a separate paragraph for the recommendations, which again is an essential part that I'll get to in a sec. Obviously, you write this executive summary at the end of the process. So by the time you're getting around to this, you know clearly, ideally anyway, exactly what your research showed, exactly what your analysis showed, and exactly what you recommended to the business to change. So make sure you take some good time at the end of the process just to think through what your executive summary is going to look like. It's a really effective summary for the marker. And I've even heard teachers say that often, like, the first impression is super, super important in IAs. And if they get a good first impression of your IA from this summary, that's perfect. So here, just quickly, you have your introduction. You don't get marked specifically on the introduction, but it does reflect well in your criterion G, your criterion H. just give a quick rundown of what your business is, what your business does, what they sell, and try and make it, if you can, relevant to your particular area of study and your topic for the business and the IA. So I, for example, was doing my IA on HR. So I talked about how many people it employs and the fact that my business has control of its internal processes. So any recommendations, essentially, that I give them, they can actually put in place. So if you can, try and make your introduction quite specific and relevant to what your IA topic is. Don't put any extraneous information in if it doesn't need to be in there. Remember, you're under quite a strict word count. You're at 2,000 words. And this is what I wrote is without these in-text references. That's like less than 200 words for your introduction. So that's a fairly simple one to write. You can get that one done fairly quickly. So now you get onto methodology employed. So this is where we're talking about, in your criteria, we're talking about criterion B in particular, and later on that'll morph into criterion C. But so criterion B, it asks you the primary sources selected and the data collected are appropriate, varied, and sufficient, justification of use of primary data required to answer the research question. So in your methodology employed, you're going to want to justify, again, similar to what you did in your proposal, justify what you used and why you used it in terms of research. So you want to talk about what you did to make this process optimal for the people who are answering your surveys or doing interviews. For example, I said these surveys were made completely anonymous to encourage candid responses. Stuff like that is good to put in. Essentially, just justify why your particular forms of primary research were the ones you chose. And you don't need to go on sales tactics here. You just have to say, this is why I chose them. And if you have a decent justification for it, that's all they want. Now, this is one very important trick. So this is one of probably the top 3 things I think you should be getting out of this video. One of your criteria, as I said, is reflective thinking. This is a really, really good place to try and get those reflective thinking marks. At least that was what was told by my teacher, and it worked for me. So in your methodology employed section, in your action plan, how you talked about the individual issues that you encountered and how you fixed those. Here, you want to reinforce that and go into more detail. So I actually spent a good few words in this methodology employed section talking about the problems that I faced and how I fixed them. That's a big part of the reflective thinking criteria, as I talked about before. So essentially, as I said, take what's in your action plan, expand it, flesh it out, tell the full story, and tell how you reflected on your thinking along the way in your processes and change that. That's a surefire way to get those 2 reflection marks. And with quite a low scoring IA like it is out of 25, every little mark counts. So that's what they want to see. They want to see that forward thinking, reflective thinking in this methodology employed section. If you do that, those are the action plan and that are the 2 main things you're going to want for criterion I. So it's really simple, right? This isn't, again, as I said, reinventing the wheel. This is a fairly simple process. So that isn't too difficult. I briefly talked about the analysis techniques I use. So fishbone diagrams, etc. Basically restating what I had in my proposal. So that can be quite a simple process, writing the methodology employed section if you know what to do. Okay, main results and findings. So this taps into criterion B, but also criterion C, because tools, techniques, and theories, that's how you represent this data, that's how you analyze it. Stuff like that is really important for those 2 criteria. Just talking very briefly about what works in terms of surveying, in terms of getting the marks for this section and thinking about that in advance. Again, it depends on your particular IA, but it's often very useful to have, if you're asking questions in a survey, it's often very useful to have a linear 1 to 5 or 1 to 4 for a particular question. So for example, I wrote, just as a general question, how would you rate your overall experience with HR at 9 to 10? On a simple 1 to 5 scale, that can be really intuitively displayed. It's really super clear to the marker. Also pie charts are quite good for that. especially if it's a non-numerical question. Just make sure the marker can see exactly what your research is showing in this process. And that's super easy to do if you just have linear 1 to 5 or like a linear set of any answers to a question. So if you do that with your surveying, this section can be pretty much a breeze. If you're doing surveys, you have a ton of individual questions that you put in your survey. Just put the most important ones in this core main results and findings section. Say to the marker that you can find the full list of survey results in an appendix. That's what I did, just pick out the most important ones, the ones you want them to remember in particular for the analysis that comes later. And just briefly at the beginning here, I don't think you have to do this, but I did this to make it extra clear to the marker because, again, part of this whole process is making it super, super crystal clear what you're doing when you're doing it, and making sure the marker doesn't have to read for implication. So I don't know if this is necessary, but I put, because I had a linear scale for all of my survey questions, I calculated the average score out of 5 for all of those questions. I got 3.99 out of 5, so I said that was an average satisfaction rate of 79.9%, indicating that the results are mostly positive. So that can be a neat little trick if you want to make it extra clear for the marker. Again, not essential, but it can be good. So you also be putting what other forms of research you did in this main results and findings section. You'll probably be doing interview results, at least the majority will. So I put the results of my interview here. I interviewed 2 people, so I just gave a quick summary of where the 2 interviewees had similar views and where they contradicted themselves. And quite often it's those points of contradiction that make some good material for analysis later down the line. So just do that. Quick summary, again, keep in mind the word count can be quite strict. And put the 4 interviews, as I said, similar to the results above, in appendices. And again, whatever you do, whether you might be doing on the job, like observation of the work, just do a quick summary of what that looked like, the things you noticed. Again, doesn't have to be too long. All right, so now we're up to the biggie. I don't think there's any way to step around it. This is the most important part of your HOIA. The analysis and discussion section. If you've seen the criteria, this makes up 6 marks out of your 25. So that's over 1/5 of your marks for the whole IA. So obviously this is a really important section. This is where you'll be putting the vast majority of your words. And there are some specific things you want to do in this section, but this is also the section where there are no hard and fast rules between IAs, and it will depend on what you specifically did as your research and your topic. So I'm going to tell you what worked for me as an HR IA in particular, and hopefully some of those tips can be applied to other topics. Because again, this is the most important part of your IA. This will be, in many cases, probably the difference between a 5 or 6 or a 7 for many, many IAs. So this is what you want to do. If you look at the criteria, it says there is a skillful analysis for 6 of the results and findings, a coherent integration of ideas, and consistent evidence of substantiated evaluation. The analysis and evaluation must be appropriate, so show sound integration of ideas and issues, coherent order, show consistent evidence of critical reflective thinking, etc., etc. So this is my particular analysis and discussion section. What you're going to want to do before you even come to write this section and you're just in the brainstorming point, I think it's useful to, as I said, brainstorm out what are the biggest things that your research showed. So what are the biggest, clearest, most distinct points that came up in your research? Now that might be problems that the business has, that might be things that your research showed the business can do well. And again, you can talk about that. In fact, you probably should talk about things the business currently do well with your topic in order to present a balanced argument. So never think you have to go trawling for problems and things through all of the research. Sometimes good to talk about the positives. And just generally what the owners of the business deem most important around your topic. So for me, my main points that I talked about, because I was talking about non-financial rewards, I found the main points in my research and my interviews. A lot of the interviewees and the surveys talked about how heavily departmentalized Banner Mitre 10 was. So that was my first big thing that I brainstormed out. The second thing they pointed out is how continuous professional development, which is essentially, you've studied this in the course, it's ongoing training, how that was also a fairly big element in the business, how there were problems with that. So that was two individual things. And the third one was an idea given by one of the employees that I could analyze that seemed to work quite well as an idea. So there was easily 1, 2, 3, the biggest problems and things that in your mind the business has, your research showed, and the things that you can write about the best. So just pick out those 3 or 4 most important things, and that will form your structure, because essentially this is like one big long essay in analysis with major body paragraphs. So in terms of writing about your actual points, okay, so I'm going to talk about this, I'm going to talk about departmentalization about the business, whether that's a good or bad thing. I'm going to talk about X, Y, Z. What you want to do, you want to follow this structure for all your body paragraphs. You want to talk about, this is something I came up with. This is a formula that I followed pretty much the entire way through this analysis section. So there are 3 points to it. Research showed, apply, and impacts. Research showed, apply, and impacts. That is the structure you want to follow for every single one of your paragraphs. So research showed. What you want to do at the beginning of each paragraph and when you're about to make a point is show what your primary research showed, literally, in regards to that particular point. So I talked about here how my primary research showed that Mitre 10 was heavily departmentalized, referring back to the appendices, referring even directly quoting some parts of my interviews. Again, they like to see that because that's direct and substantial use of evidence that you've collected through the whole process. Essentially give them a rundown of what your primary research revealed in regards to that particular issue. And that's where you'll talk about, the conflicts maybe between views of employees or where they matched up. So that's a fairly straightforward one. Just, you'll be going through that for about a third of the paragraph, about that much, or I think actually that much, for my PDF section. So that's longer than usual, but normally it's about a third. Now, this is the most important section, the apply. This will depend on what individual topic you're doing, how you write this, because this is where you bring in the tools and the theories that are essentially the bulk of this analysis and evaluation section, because that shows critical thinking. And again, I can't speak for other AA styles, but for HR, if you're doing an HR AA, and that's why personally I'm biased, because I would recommend an HR AA to everybody. What you do here is mention a specific HR theory and apply that to the business. So that comes after you reveal what your research showed, then you analyze that research to come to a conclusion. That sounds convoluted, but it's really, really isn't. I can promise you that. So I applied, for example, Pink's motivational theory, which states that the 3 key motivators for all employees are autonomy, mastery, purpose. Easy. I said that it's clear the departmentalization of the business helps fill the autonomy and the purpose modes. Again, this is super straightforward, right? But it's really, really, really important to do, to have those particular, very, very clear points of analysis. Easy in HR, in my opinion, because you can just take these theories on motivation and corporate culture and say in the business's case whether they're good in that theory's opinion or whether the business is bad in that theory's opinion. It doesn't have to be particular individual theories though. I know that's particularly difficult in for example, finance and I think marketing as well can have trouble with that. So in cases like that, just make sure you use a lot of key business terminology. Make it essentially super clear that you're pulling from the syllabus, that you're giving the marker what they want. So that's what you do in the apply section. Take things from the syllabus and your textbook, apply them through the business lens, and see what that tells you. And again, you can sort of manipulate the conclusions off that to your own ends, as long as it's coherently and cogently argued. And then the final section in each paragraph should be impacts, in my opinion. I don't think this is necessarily like the be all and end all of each paragraph. I think the apply is probably the be all and end all in the analysis and discussion. But I think this is really good to put in what you think the impacts of what the business is currently doing are going to be on the long term, or what you think the impacts of a potential change that you're suggesting could be for the business on the long term. I think that shows, and this is really good in your QGIS essays as well, I find, just as a general tip. What that shows is that you've thought reflectively and critically about what your changes mean for the business and what individual things will look going forward. So I said long-term impacts of using worker participation as a non-financial reward includes strong sense of empowerment. The employees will be more productive and thus turnover will increase. Done. Bam. Really super simple. Just what you think the impacts of that will be on the long term, because that shows you've thought critically and reflectively. And sometimes it's just little touches like that that can push you into the higher marks. So that's a paragraph done. With research showed, apply, impacts. That's the structure I'd recommend you follow for pretty much every paragraph, and that's what I do. So again, make this section long. Don't be afraid to make it long. Put in as much analysis as you think is applicable and as you think would not be bloated, which is not a big problem with this. I think you want a lot of meaty content for the markers to work through in the analysis and discussion. A lot of times it's probably good to have a visual form of analysis, things like force field analyses. Even decision trees can fit easily inside the core of your analysis and discussion section. They're really good to put in a super visual and intuitive way of showing the marker that you're thinking critically and applying tools. That can be really impressive. I did a fishbone diagram, which is essentially the factors leading to a problem just put in different nodes here. So how specialization leads to continuous professional development being viewed negatively, how social factors do and how time factors do. I put that in there, make sure the text is big enough to read, obviously. That was one of the big pieces of feedback I got from my practice AA. So that's super nice to put in just to show the marker that you mean business and that you're literally, mean business, and that you're thinking in a critical way. So I think I've gone through the bulk of that. Essentially, you want to go through that research showed, apply, impact, structure, pretty much every paragraph. And then if you do that, you've basically got a complete analysis and discussion section. And that's all you need to do, in my opinion, to get a 5 or 6. But strangely, a lot of people don't do it. So I hope I've sort of revealed to you the secrets of that. And now on to the last part. And this seems like a minor part in the scheme of things, but it really isn't, because this is actually 4 marks of your overall 25, even though it's such a short section. The conclusions and recommendations is, how many words did I write? So 173, which is tiny, but they're also super important. Now, a lot of people have very different approaches to how they do this section, because in conclusions and recommendations, it's pretty self-explanatory. You're going to bring up the conclusions that your research showed and your analysis showed, and the things you'd recommend the business to do. Some people write this in paragraph form as like a one integrated section. I personally would err away from that, because I think the problem with doing that is it can often seem unclear what your specific conclusions are, where they start, and how they differ from your recommendations. So what I did is just literally dot point out 1, 2, 3 conclusions, 1, 2, 3 recommendations. I even, and this is probably a bit heavy-handed, but I even literally bolded the core of the conclusion. So for instance, the heavy departmentalization of Banner Minor 10 has both helped and hindered employee motivation. Bam. Give a little more detail here. If it's cogent, it generally is. Just make the conclusion super succinct, clear, precise. 3 probably good, important tips for the rest of the IA. And just make it extra clear what your conclusions are, so that you can just get those 2 easy marks. And as long as they're substantiated and consistent with the evidence presented in the main body of the report, are developed by those things. And if appropriate, you can mention further areas of study that can help with your reflection marks, but it's not essential. As long as you have that dot pointed out and extremely clear, you'll get those marks. And it's a very similar story with the recommendations. I just have super simple, clear recommendations based on each of these three conclusions. So conclusion 1 was how departmentalization has helped in hindered employee motivation. So my applicable recommendation was, it's recommended that the senior staff investigate methods of introducing job rotation between departments while also maintaining the current use of worker participation as a non-financial reward. That relates specifically to my point 1, and same with point 2, continuous professional development is weak as a non-financial reward. My recommendation, which is applicable, CPD should remain in use, but it should be conducted in person to make it stronger. If you do that, again, that gets you your 4 marks for that section. And this is a section that a lot of people do tend to, I think, lose marks on and get wrong because it's not clear and precise enough exactly what their conclusions and recommendations are. So if you can do that, you're well ahead of the pack already. So the very last thing you have, a bibliography, obviously. Your appendices, so for my interviews, and if you do interviews too, I'd recommend doing the same. Make a table, what the question you wrote was, and what the interviewee's response was. Record your interviews on your phone if allowed, just to make it easier to transcribe what they said. So that's super simple. And your full survey results in another appendix if you're doing a survey like I did, or whatever other form of research, you do the same. Just put it all out in full. It's quite impressive for the marker to see a whole list of questions you ask, because it shows that you've been comprehensive and thorough with your research. And if you're referring to some theory or some visual theory, for example, I referred to Maslow's hierarchy of needs as an apply for my core body paragraphs in the analysis and discussion. If that's a visual sort of thing, it's often useful to put it in the appendix. You don't have to do that, but if it'll make your analysis clearer, just do it. Like, why not, honestly? And that covers it. That's it. That's your IA pretty much done. If you follow those steps, make sure everything is super succinct and concise and straight to the point of exactly what you want to say. If you follow this research showed apply impact section for all of your analysis and discussion paragraphs, you're on the path to a 7. Again, this is not reinventing the wheel, this IA. This is one of the more fun IAs to do. It's actually, in my opinion, one of the easier IAs to do if you have the clear structure and direction for it. I didn't, to an extent, and I only realized a lot of these things in retrospect about how succinct you should be, so I could have probably even gone further with some of that succinctness in my actual report writing, but other than that, this is an IA I really enjoyed writing, and I think if you follow these tips and tricks, you should too, and not only will you enjoy it, you also get a 7. So I wish you the best of luck in all your IA writing endeavors. If you have any specific questions that you wanted to ask more about, or things you're confused from this video, feel free to get in touch with Eamon. He'll refer you to me. I'll be free to answer any question you have about this IA writing process. The point is just to make it as easy as possible for you. So I think that about covers it. Thank you for watching. I hope I helped, and best of luck in all your IA writing endeavors. See ya.